I personally don't believe that trans women are women, particularly in the context of sports. But why is this disagreement suddenly violence? And why is disagreement suddenly discrimination or bigotry?
Fox delivering the knees, and that's it. Fallon Fox. Holy cow!
What was going on here was this woman who used to be a man for 32 years transitioned to being a woman and it didn't tell anybody. Fought two different women who thought they were fighting a woman and got fucking smashed. I was watching it. It was like watching a man fight a woman. That's what I was watching.
It's a sensitive topic, but I do believe it's a necessary one. That most women I've personally spoken to, quietly, off camera, and even if they're transgender or gay, are not comfortable with trans women competing in women's categories either. We've just never been allowed to say it out loud.
I absolutely do not support transgender athletes in women's sports.
There should be limitations, especially trans women in sports.
No trans women in women's sports. It's just not fair.
I decided to research what the main arguments are for supporting trans women competing in women's sports. I just want to understand both sides clearly. So, based on my research, supporters of trans women competing in women's sports make three main arguments. First, they argue that sport has never been fair in the first place. Even among biological women, there are natural differences in height, strength, speed, genetics, and those advantages are already accepted in sport. Second, they argue that hormone therapy reduces male advantages enough to make competition fair. So as long as testosterone is suppressed into female ranges for a set period of time, they believe that playing field is effectively leveled. And third, they argue that... So I think at the end of the day, the question is, where do we go from here?
With almost 2 million followers across all platforms, Kelley Day is now the most followed anchor on the PGMN roster. A Viva actress, movie star, and commercial model who's racked up tens of millions of views on YouTube. She built her career on visibility beyond beauty, discipline, and cultural presence, establishing herself as a recognizable force on screen and across the country. She represented the Philippines on the international stage, winning Miss Eco Philippines at Miss World 2019 and finishing second at Miss Eco International 2021, proving she could stand out on a global level. But her real story is not about success. It's about resilience. After being medically diagnosed with severe panic disorder in 2022 that crippled her for some years, Kelley made the difficult decision to step away from public life. What followed was a period of therapy, recovery, and rebuilding, choosing growth over pressure and clarity over noise. She returned not just for performance, but for purpose. Today, she speaks openly about mental health, alopecia, and autoimmune conditions, using her platform to bring awareness to struggles that are often hidden. She also supports animal rescue and advocacy, rooted in compassion and responsibility, having gone viral multiple times for spending hundreds of thousands of her own money to save the lives of dozens of stray cats. Her perspective is shaped by both experience and conviction. She values critical thinking, open dialogue, and the courage to engage with difficult ideas, drawing inspiration from voices like Candace Owens, whom she has looked up to for years. Kelley Day is not just a personality. She is proof that strength can be rebuilt, that authenticity still matters, and that identity can evolve from the foundations of show business into true, elevated societal and cultural value. And that is why today, Kelley Day is proudly PGMN.
This episode is about women's sports and transgender inclusion. It's a sensitive topic, but I do believe it's a necessary one, especially now when all sorts of policies, rules, and women are already being affected.
I absolutely do not support transgender athletes in women's sports. I never have.
There are vanishingly few trans girls competing in high school sports anywhere, and even if there were more, trans kids, like all kids, vary in athletic ability, and there is no evidence that they pose any threat to safety or fairness.
There should be limitations, especially trans women in sports.
Right.
Come on. Let's be real about this, because the energy that you have as a male person, right? You still have that testosterone with you.
Yep.
It's still higher than the women's hormones. And so it would be an unfair advantage for real women, your born women, to be competing against trans women. So there's an unfair advantage there.
The opinion of, if you're a woman, you should play. If you consider yourself a woman, and you want to play sports, or vice versa, you should be able to play.
Do you think transgender women should be able to participate?
That's your question you want me to ask. I mean, you want to ask, so I'll give you that. Yes, and I'm okay with that.
No trans women in women's sports. I think you have to go that far because it's not fair. It's just not fair.
Before I get into my own experience in the Philippines, it helps to look at how we got here in the first place. There's actually a long timeline behind the transgender movement, and it goes back much further than most people realize. So, let's rewind a bit. Gender nonconformity has existed across cultures for centuries. Different societies have had people who lived outside traditional male and female roles, sometimes socially and sometimes spiritually. Much later on, around the 1910s and 20s, the concept of gender began to be addressed by modern institutions of medicine and policy. During this time, the first documented medical transitions took place in Germany. Dora Richter underwent experimental medical procedures at Berlin's Institute for Sexual Science. Dora is a milestone in this timeline for being the first person on record to undergo a full surgical male-to-female gender-affirming transition. But in 1933, the Nazi regime shut down and destroyed the institute. Records were lost, and information about Dora Richter's ultimate fate is unknown to this day. In the mid-1900s, gender identity entered medicine and psychology more formally, and one influential psychologist at the time was John Money. He promoted the idea that gender identity could be shaped purely socially, regardless of biological sex. He tested this theory on a boy named David Raymer, whose penis was irreparably damaged during a failed circumcision in infancy. Following the injury, Dr. Money advised David's parents to raise him as a girl.
Try and convince him that he was doing it because he was a tomboy, and that it was okay to be himself, or herself, I would say at the time. It was okay to be herself, but she was very much a tomboy.
I tried to fit in. I tried with the makeup, and it turned out to be a disaster. I mean, you got the red circles on the cheeks. I look like a clown, basically. But I didn't do it because I liked it. I did it because I wanted so desperately to fit in because I was so lonely. And I let one boy kiss me on my cheek once, and I thought about it. I said, no, I don't like this.
So David was renamed Brenda, and he underwent surgeries to make his body appear female, and then was later given female hormones during puberty. This was done to test the belief that gender identity could be shaped entirely through upbringing, and that biology did not determine whether someone would identify as male or female. And for years, the Brenda case was presented as a success. Dr. Money published papers claiming the transition had worked, and the case was widely cited as proof that gender identity was primarily social. Those claims had real consequences. They influenced medical thinking and helped justify early medical interventions for children experiencing gender dysphoria, including hormonal treatment and even in some cases, surgery. But years later, the truth came out. David had never accepted the female identity imposed on him. In fact, throughout his childhood and adolescence, he experienced deep psychological distress and confusion. He later learned what had been done to him and chose to retransition and live as a male. Despite that, the damage was already profound. David struggled with relationships, employment, and mental health for much of his adult life. And in 2004, at the age of just 38, he took his own life. The case, which had once been used to support a theory about gender identity, was later widely criticized for its ethical issues and outcomes. Now, despite this, the theory itself didn't disappear, and the idea that gender identity was separate from biological sex continued to influence academic thinking, and eventually, policy. Over time, those ideas moved out of universities and into institutions that actually set rules, including in sport. So in 2004, the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC, introduced guidelines called the Stockholm Consensus, which allows transgender athletes to compete, but only after the 3 following requirements: surgical transition, 2 years of hormones, and receiving legal gender recognition. So at the time, this was intended as a cautious and medically controlled approach. And for years after the IOC's implementation, transgender issues, including participation in sport, remained relatively niche. They existed mostly within the academic, the medical, and the activist circles, but they were not yet a central public debate. And that raises an important question. What changed? Around 2011 to 2012, transgender topics began appearing far more frequently in mainstream media and public discourse.
Sit there looking so good, thinking that you think the fight is over. The fight has just begun. You come from a family of revolution. That is the foundation from which you were born. You literally come from human beings who not only know how to picket, we know how to win.
This is the civil rights issue of our time. And we're fighting for trans justice, we're also fighting for racial justice. We're fighting for reproductive justice. We're fighting for immigrant rights. We're fighting against anti-Semitism and xenophobia.
Google Trends data shows that searches for the term transgender in the United States remained relatively low and flat throughout the 2000s. But beginning around 2011 and accelerating into 2012, search interest more than doubled compared to the previous years. That period marks the first sustained rise in public online attention to transgender issues. Now, this surge came after more than a decade of political strain in the United States. The aftermath of 9/11, prolonged wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the 2008 financial crisis. By the time President Obama was running for re-election in 2012, many of the major promises tied to those crises had not been fulfilled. Which leads to another question. Why did cultural wars, including transgender issues, move so suddenly to the center of public conversation at that moment? Was this a genuine grassroots shift in public concern? Or did cultural debates become a convenient distraction at a time that public confidence in the government was declining, shifting attention away from those failures? Well, we may never know the real reason why. But what we do know is that when these cultural war issues started becoming more mainstream, it began influencing real-world decisions, including institutional policies in sport. And this story matters because it helps to explain why transgender participation in sport became such a flashpoint in the years that followed. In 2013, that reality became especially visible in combat sports. Fallon Fox, a transgender woman who transitioned in her early 30s, began competing in women's mixed martial arts after having previously gone through male puberty. Fox fought in regional MMA promotions and recorded several wins.
Throws and reversals by both fighters.
These girls are getting right into it. Fox delivering the knees, and that's it. Fallon Fox. Holy cow!
Her participation drew significant attention within the sport.
What was going on here was this woman who used to be a man for 32 years transitioned to being a woman and it didn't tell anybody and fought two different women who thought they were fighting a woman and got fucking smashed. Well, I was watching it. It was like watching a man fight a woman. That's what I was watching. I was like, this isn't like particularly, she wasn't particularly skillful. It wasn't like she had like some unbelievable background in judo like Ronda Rousey or something like that. It wasn't that. You were just literally watching a former man beat up women who never had the benefit of 30 years plus of testosterone in their body.
Particularly after opponents raised concerns about the safety and competitive fairness in a full contact setting, where differences in strength, bone density, and power can carry serious risk. The controversy wasn't limited to fans or commentators. In fact, at the time, Ronda Rousey, the UFC's first female champion, publicly weighed in on that issue.
Fallon Fox's case, she went through puberty entirely as a man, and though I do believe that, you know, her identity definitely is that of a woman, I mean, just at this point in her life, it's just not scientifically possible to make her body exactly equal to that of a woman. If it was in another case, someone who was identified much earlier and underwent hormone suppression, and then later when they were old enough to make the decision, underwent the surgery, I think that would be much more understandable. But I think transgender fighters should be taken by case-by-case basis, and if you already developed through puberty as a man, I don't think you should be able to compete as a woman.
She argued that competing against someone who had gone through male puberty presented real physical concerns, especially in a sport where athletes are striking and grappling at full force. This moment marked one of the first times the discussion around transgender inclusion moved from theory into physical consequence, and it forced sports organizations, athletes, and the public to confront questions that didn't have easy answers. Then, In 2015, the public transition of Caitlyn Jenner brought transgender issues into mainstream conversation like never before.
Caitlyn Jenner dazzles as she accepts the Woman of the Year award from Glamour magazine. The magazine honored Jenner for being a transgender champion.
Maybe this is why God put me on this earth, to tell my story, to be authentic to myself about who I am. And maybe in doing that, maybe you can make a difference in the world.
And soon after, many institutions began expanding inclusion policies, aiming to reduce discrimination and, of course, support mental health. And at the time, these policies didn't appear to cause major disruption in women's sport. So that same year, the IOC revised its guidelines. Surgery was no longer required. Trans women could compete in women's categories as long as testosterone levels stayed below a certain threshold for at least 12 months before competition, and that level be maintained during eligibility. At the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, history was made when Laura Hubbard became the first openly transgender woman to compete in the Olympics. And no, she didn't bag the gold medal. In fact, she was eliminated as she failed to complete a valid lift in the Olympic weightlifting competition. However, in the same year, a Canadian football player named Quinn became the first openly trans, non-binary athlete to win a gold medal in the Olympic Games. These historical moments, although triumphal for some, really began to stir the pot. In March 2022, a massive controversy at the NCAA Women's Swimming Championships emerged, involving Riley Gaines, a biological female, and Leah Thomas, a trans female. Both finished with the same race time.
Me and Leah just recently tied at the NCAA Championships, and honestly, I think the NCAA handled everything extremely poorly, starting from when we finished and I went behind the podium to collect my 5th place trophy, and they kind of blatantly told me that Leah would hold the 5th place trophy and that I could pose with the 6th place trophy for photos and would be mailed a 5th place trophy in the mail.
But Gaines was placed 6th by the organization, and she was asked to hand the 5th place trophy to Thomas for photographs. By June 2022, World Aquatics changed its policy, excluding trans women who went through male puberty from competing in elite women's competitions. And instead, they proposed an open category. In March 2023, World Athletics did similar. In March 2024, Riley Gaines and over a dozen other athletes filed a lawsuit against the NCAA.
Really what we're hoping for out of this lawsuit is that the NCAA enforces fair and safe competition and privacy in areas of undressing.
And in April 2024, the UK released the CAS review, which found weak and inconsistent evidence to support medical interventions, such as puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors. They decided to shift towards a more cautious approach by focusing instead on psychological support. In January 2025, a US executive order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government was signed, directing federal agencies to treat sex as strictly biological and rolling back federal recognition of gender identity, including in sports and federally funded programs. In April 2025, the UK Supreme Court clarified that under the Equality Act, the legal definition of woman when it comes to sex-based protections refers to biological sex. And by June 1, 2025, England's Football Association announced that trans women would no longer be eligible to compete in women's football. The IOC has set a target of early 2026 to announce a new gender eligibility policy for the Olympic Games that could include rules excluding transgender athletes from women's sports. And what happened to me on a football field, right here in the Philippines, sits right inside this larger story. Okay, so a few months ago, I was playing in a football tournament here in the Philippines, an all-women's category. Well, at least that was to my understanding. One of the opposing teams had a trans woman as the coach of the team. And just to be clear, no one had an issue with the coach being trans, and the coach was openly coaching their team. No one opposed to it or had any problem with it. I didn't even hear anyone make kind of comment about it. The concern only began when the coach, as our team was about to play against them, changed into a football uniform of the women's team that they were coaching and decided to play. I didn't notice it at first, but our coach, a male, pointed it out and immediately requested that the organization take the transgender coach off of the pitch as a player. And our coach knew that player not only has years of experience playing football, but is also not a biological woman. And this is a beginners all-women tournament. And within a few minutes of deliberation, the transgender coach was removed from playing on the field, but was still allowed to resume coaching duties, of course. And after that, at least on our end, we went about the game, and I never heard my coach or my teammates say anything about the incident. But not more than a few days after the tournament, the transgender coach put up a post on social media, describing the event in a negative way, and showing that they were distraught by the discrimination and transphobia that they experienced. When I saw the post, I was literally in shock because it didn't reflect what actually happened. Since their post didn't name individuals, I will also respect their anonymity. But once you make something public, people talk. And within the football community, people really talked. And now, with the public platform I have, I think I owe it to myself, to my team, and to the women's football community, and especially my coach, to tell the other side of the story. Because people were even coming up to me and saying, "Did you hear what happened at the tournament last week? Did you see that post? Crazy." And they were surprised when I said I was actually there, and it was my team and my coach who was accused of transphobia, bigotry, and discrimination. And when I explained the full context, they were surprised again, because in that post, important details were missing. We never laughed at the coach when the coach was taken off the playing field. We, at least my coach and I, are not anti-trans. We are not bigots. What we are is pro-woman and pro-safety. And I'm so grateful for my coach for standing up for us women and keeping the game fair when others were too quiet to speak. I personally don't believe that trans women are women, particularly in the context of sports. But why is this disagreement suddenly violence? And why is disagreement suddenly discrimination or bigotry? I believe we should still be allowed to ask questions about biology, about safety, and about fairness. Because asking questions means we're trying to get this right. And because I truly believe this, I decided to research what the main arguments are for supporting trans women competing in women's sports. I just want to understand both sides clearly. So, based on my research, supporters of trans women competing in women's sports make three main arguments. First, they argue that sport has never been fair in the first place. Even among biological women, there are natural differences in height, strength, speed, genetics, and those advantages are already accepted in sport. Second, they argue that hormone therapy reduces male advantages enough to make competition fair. So as long as testosterone is suppressed into female ranges for a set period of time, they believe that playing field is effectively leveled. And third, they argue that women's sports exist mainly because of historical discrimination, not because of biology, and that defending sex-based categories today is simply discrimination under a different label. Now here's the problem, and my honest perspective. First of all, sport is not organized around rare exceptions. It's organized around groups, averages, and upper limits. Because that's how teams are selected, that's how medals are won, and that's how records are broken. On average, male bodies are taller, heavier, stronger, faster, and more powerful than female bodies, especially after puberty. Men just have more muscle mass, denser bones, larger hearts and lungs, and greater power output. And these differences are well documented and consistent across populations. And that's why women's categories exist. Because without them, sports doesn't become more fair, it becomes male dominated.
Say LeBron James changed his gender. You know what I mean? Okay, can he stay in the NBA? Or, because he's a woman, does he have to go to the WNBA where he will score 840 points a game? What does it actually mean to be equal? You know what I mean? Like, if women are actually equal to men, then there would be no WNBA, would there? You would just be good enough to play in the NBA with us. Or, here's another idea that's gonna be very controversial. You could shut the fuck up.
And if sex-based categories were removed and athletes were selected purely by performance, almost no women would make elite teams. There would be 0 WNBA players. The physical baseline is just different. It's incomparable. And we've seen this reality play out repeatedly. Now there's a moment in tennis history that helps to illustrate this clearly, and it's often misunderstood if not explained properly. So in 1998, Serena Williams and Venus Williams played in a Battle of the Sexes exhibition match at the Australian Open against a 30-year-old male tennis player named Carson Brush. Now at the time, Serena was just 16 years old and still early in her professional career. Venus, on the other hand, was already established. She would actually reach world number 5 later that same year, and she was clearly an elite player. The Williams sisters had claimed that they could beat any male player ranked outside the top 200. So Brush, ranked 203, accepted the challenge. He wasn't a top star, and he wasn't in peak condition. In fact, he had partied and drank and smoked the previous night. On top of that, he was 30 years old, and by his own admission, he wasn't taking the matches particularly seriously. He initially faced Serena, and after racing to a 5-0 lead, defeated her 6-1. Venus then took the court, and Brush won again, this time 6-2. After the matches, Brush remarked that he deliberately played at the level of a world number 600, just to keep the game fun. That result wasn't about skill, discipline, or work ethic. The Williams sisters were already exceptional athletes. It came down to the baseline physical differences. Serena herself later acknowledged this, saying that men hit harder, they move faster, and they generate more power. And we've seen the same reality play out in football. In 2017, the US women's national football team played a training match against FC Dallas's under-15 boys academy team. The women lost 5-2. More recently, while preparing for Women's Euro 2025, the Swiss women's national team played a friendly against a team of 15-year-old boys, and they lost by 6 goals. But these matches aren't humiliations. They're not a judgment on women's talent or dedication. They highlight something very specific: the physical advantages created by male puberty, like speed, strength, and power, remain even when women are among the best athletes in the world. And this is where the conversation has to be honest. If sex differences weren't real or meaningful, medical transitions wouldn't exist in the first place. Hormones are taken precisely because male puberty produces physical traits that do not align with female bodies. And while hormone therapy can reduce some advantages, it does not reverse bone structure, lung capacity, shoulder width, or skeletal leverage developed over years. And that's the reality that sport has to work with. Now, when it comes to the Philippines, we are generally an accepting country. Trans women have been visible here for decades, whether it's in media, pageantry, beauty, entertainment, and even everyday life. But our acceptance has always been cultural and societal, rather than being implemented by policy and rules. In local pageantry, eligibility has been handled quite inconsistently. Some competitions have open categories, whilst others quietly maintain sex-based rules. And there's no national standard. And I'll add this as someone who's been in pageantry myself. As a former beauty queen, and as someone who knows many women in pageantry, this topic comes up privately more often than people realize. When I returned to showbiz last year after a 2-year break, someone in an interview asked me about how I felt about transgender women in women's beauty pageants. I was honestly very scared back then because I was just stepping back into showbiz and I didn't want to restart my career with a controversy. So this was my answer.
It's about time that we as a society give a space for the transgender community. And I think, most transgender people that I know do not consider themselves as a woman, and they know that what their biological composition is, and it's more so that the minority of transgenders that are really pushing for those things. So if we're sticking with the majority, I'm on board with that.
As you can see, my eyes were tense and my words were careful. In my mind, I knew my principles, my values, my rights as a woman, and I would never be okay to lie and say, oh, I absolutely would open my arms to transgender women in women's pageants. I was not raised by my parents to conform to something that I don't believe in. However, I was scared. I was hesitant to say something offensive, and I was not prepared for that question. I didn't want to say the wrong thing and get cancelled just when I was picking up my career again. But watching this clip back, I think it's clear to everyone that I was clearly beating around the bush. Now bear in mind, that time, people were still getting cancelled if they didn't agree that transgender women are real women. Angela Pons from Spain made history as the first openly transgender woman to compete in the Miss Universe pageant in 2018. In 2023, Portugal's Marina Machete became the first openly transgender contestant to reach the semifinals. Up until today, Miss Universe still allows transgender women to compete in the international competition. But what has always baffled me is that most women I've personally spoken to, quietly, off camera, and even if they're transgender or gay, are not comfortable with trans women competing in women's categories either. We've just never been allowed to say it out loud. At the end of the day, pageants, just like sports, have always been sex-based competitions. Knowingly, women's pageants such as Miss Universe and Miss World are much farther celebrated and anticipated than the men's or the Mr. equivalents. And these competitions were fundamentally built to celebrate women's beauty, experiences, rights and empowerment, advocacies, and just the overall journey of being a woman. And many people feel that if we open those categories, the fundamentals of those platforms will be changed.
Am I in favor of transgender women joining Miss Universe or competitions that are intended for women or biological women? It is my childhood dream to join Miss Universe. This is also my childhood dream to step on the stage of Miss Universe. However, part of that dream is also considering the boundaries of womanhood in terms of biologicalness. Ladies and gentlemen, my parents raised me in a sense that I should be respecting limits and boundaries of people. And I must be saying that transgender woman, I'm sorry to say this, but I'm not in favor of women joining Miss Universe competition simply because the Miss Universe competition was created in order for us to celebrate womanhood. And that womanhood, or part of it, is in order for them to share stories. Part of the stories is the process of growing from being a young lady into becoming a fine woman. And unfortunately, as a transgender, I don't have such. I did not experience menstruation. I did not experience pregnancy. And I would want that to be highlighted in Miss Universe. It's because I would want the woman to celebrate what they have, and that is full womanhood.
What's concerning is how rarely this is said publicly, because many are afraid of the backlash, including myself. But nevertheless, in public spaces, we now see all gender restrooms in some malls, some universities, cafes, and even offices. And for many people, this works fine. It reduces tension. It offers options. But those changes happened informally, without national guidelines. And that's the pattern that we keep seeing here in the Philippines. Social accommodation first, and then policy later. It's possible that that approach can work in shared spaces. But in sports, where categories exist for fairness and safety, relying on assumptions and feelings instead of rules and facts creates real problems.
She's a high school girls volleyball player. She's been urging lawmakers to take action after she suffered a concussion and a neck injury back in September from a transgender player spiking the ball during a volleyball game.
I could go on and on about how this incident has affected my life, but I'm not here for that because I'm not here for me. Allowing biological males to compete against biological females is dangerous.
The Philippines also tends to follow cultural and policy trends from the US, but usually many years later. The US and other countries have already tested these policies at scale.
Under the Trump administration, we will defend the proud tradition of female athletes, and we will not allow men to beat up, injure, and cheat our women and our girls. From now on, women's sports will be only for women.
And the outcomes have forced reassessment. The Philippines now has the opportunity to learn without repeating the same conflicts. So I think at the end of the day, the question is, where do we go from here? Given that we don't yet have clear national sports policies, I'm gonna throw a suggestion out there. Maybe women's tournaments should clearly state from the start, or even before the start, whether the competition is open to trans women or not, so that trans women know what they're signing up for, so that biological women know what they're signing up for, so that objections don't happen on the field. But is giving such a disclaimer already a form of discrimination to trans? Because it means we don't consider them as women, and that could be hurtful to them? Should us, women, just instead close our eyes and pretend that there are no biological differences between us and men? Serena Williams is widely regarded as one of the best athletes of all time, and indisputably the greatest female tennis player in history. She won 23 Grand Slam single titles and dominated women's tennis for more than 2 decades. But when asked about playing against men, this is what Serena had to say.
For me, tennis and men's tennis and women's tennis are completely almost two separate sports. So I'm like, if I were to play Andy Murray, I would lose 6-0, 6-0 in 5 to 6 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, because it's true. It's
honestly,
true. It's a completely different sport. The men are a lot faster, and they serve harder, they hit harder. It's just a different game. And
she also explained that men's and women's tennis are completely almost two separate sports, citing differences in speed and power that would make it very difficult for her to win in that situation. At the end of the day, some women, like myself, would choose not to compete in an all-women's tournament if trans players are included. But maybe other women would be totally fine with it. And maybe until the day comes that the government enforces and updates our national policies, I think both choices deserve respect, and clarity should be provided off of the field rather than in the middle of the game. Because I do believe in kindness, and I do believe in safety, but I believe, more than anything, that women should be allowed to talk without fear. My name is Kelley Day, and we are proudly PGMN.
May simple akong tanong, may respeto pa ba tayo sa sarili natin bilang mamamayan?
In Transparency International's 2012 Corruption Perception Index, the Philippines placed 105th out of 176 countries this year.
Mula 101 noong 2016 hanggang 111 nitong 2017.
Pang 120 ang Pilipinas kumpara sa kabuang bilang na 182 na mga bansa na kasama sa pag-aaral na ito.
Corruption is not complicated. Kapag may ghost project, may kulang na classroom. Kapag may overpriced contract, may kulang na gamot. Tanong lang, dapat ba talagang normal ito? Kasi kung titignan natin ng maayos,
sa halip na plataporma ang talakayan, pera ang bumida sa taong bayan.
may mali. Normal na sa atin ang hirap. Normal na sa atin ang pila. Normal na ang delay. Normal na ang pasensya na. Because when a problem repeats itself for decades, it is no longer an accident. It is tolerated. Competence matters. Integrity matters. Track record matters. And so does specific plans. Tanungin natin ang direkta. Number 1, ano ang eksaktong gagawin mo sa edukasyon? Number 2, ano ang timeline? Number 3, ano ang budget? Number 4, number 5, and number 6. And here's what makes it worse, the supply.
I am now calling for those who are guilty of robbing the people to repent. Repent! Repent!
Walang magbabago kung pareho pa rin ang binoboto at pareho pa rin ang dahilan kung bakit natin binoboto. Self-respect is disciplined. It asks questions, it checks facts, it demands answers, and it refuses to reward failure. Mga kaibigan, ang pagbabago hindi nagsisimula sa kandidato. Nagsisimula sa atin. Now here is the uncomfortable part.